if you just make small changes to either a pill or you make a pump, even a pump that works well, all you're doing is replacing the dopamine. You're just replacing dopamine in a different way. And so if you think about it, you have that way of treating Parkinson. You have deep brain stimulation, which has helped a lot of people. And that's where an electrode is placed into the brain. And by the electrode stimulating, it's actually able to turn off a person's tremor. It's amazing what we're able to do. But we're not changing the underlying nature of the Parkinson disease. We're not fixing the mitochondria. We're not fixing the cells. And so our goal is to do that.
Welcome to the Hope and Help podcast, where we talk about science and science-based tools for fatigue and chronic illness. I'm your host, Haylie Pomroy. I'm a #1 New York Times best-selling author of The Fast Metabolism Diet, a leading health and wellness expert, a PhD student in Neuro-Immunology, and a fierce advocate for those in need of a little bit of help and hope. Today, we're going to talk about Parkinson's disease. And we are so fortunate, guys, to be joined again with the Dr. Daniel Kantor. Dr. Kantor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
As you guys know, you've had him here before. You had lots of questions. Dr. Kantor is an MD. He's a neurologist. He's the president emeritus of the Florida Society of Neurology. But Dr. Kantor, you're also vice president of clinical research and development at Gateway Institute for Brain Research. Can you tell me a little bit about what Gateway is?
Absolutely. Gateway Institute for Brain Research is a translational medicine research institute with one clear mission: cure Parkinson's disease.
Ooh, I got chills.
Not treat a little bit, not make a little bit better, not change your dopamine, but cure Parkinson's disease. Our goal is that everyone at the Institute has to focus on something else next because we're going to cure this disease.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you brought up the term translational medicine research. So at the Institute for Neuro-Immune Medicine, it's so important that we shorten the gap between science concepts and we call it, from the bench to the bedside, right? To patient intervention. And is that what you're doing at Gateway specifically?
At Gateway, we actually have people not who just work with human beings, clinical research. We start out actually mathematically, and we start out in silico, it's called, with computer scientists. And what they're doing is they're trying to program and model what's going on in the human brain and the human neurons. Then we go from there to in vitro. So in vitro is going to be the microscopes, what people most of the time think of when they think of research. Or they think someone behind a microscope looking at a Petri dish, that sort of research. But very focused based on what we learned from the computer models. And then we also, fortunately or unfortunately, have the in vivo lab as well, where we actually study animals and unfortunately rodent models of Parkinson's disease. Then what happens is it comes over to the clinical side. And that's where I'm the vice president of clinical research and development, because our goal is to get it very fast from the beginning of the concept all the way to human beings so that people can get better and hopefully we can make some really good discoveries.
That's exciting. I want to take a step back for a minute and help me understand what exactly is Parkinson's, because there's kind of this group of neurologic disorders that a lot of people talk about. But Parkinson's got, there's been some actors that have come out and talked about Parkinson's, some big names. And so help me from a neurology perspective understand what exactly is Parkinson's.
200 years ago, a neurologist by the name of Parkinson, was actually his last name, he was doing what we call urban neurology. He was actually walking around the streets of London and he would see people walk just not quite right, or they would shuffle their gait, or their movement was different. And he started describing it. And he described it in what now is considered the first description of what we call Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease, as opposed to other things we've talked about, like multiple sclerosis, where multiple sclerosis we're pretty sure is autoimmune. We're pretty sure that it's an effect where the central nervous system gets attacked by the immune system. In Parkinson, we're not quite sure why it happens, but we know a little bit more about what's going on. In Parkinson's disease, we see damage to the specific kinds of neurons called these dopaminergic neurons. So they make dopamine. And you think of dopamine as a neurotransmitter that helps you with this idea of reward, this idea of pleasure.
Feel good. Yeah, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Yeah.
But also to make your movement more fluid. And so it's not just dopamine, but other neurotransmitters. But we've really focused because the most visible sign of Parkinson's disease is actually tremor. That's what people think of when they think of a Parkinson's disease. They think of a person who's got a resting tremor, meaning not when they're reaching for something, but even just when their hands are right there and they're doing this pill rolling resting tremor. Person's going to be moving slower. We call that bradykinesia. Person's going to have what we call cogwheel rigidity.
What's that?
So what happens is the neurologist will go and examine you and will check. Normally your arm should just move nicely. But when someone has rigidity, it's harder to move it. When they have cogwheel rigidity, it feels like catch. That catch is actually because there's a tremor included with the rigidity. And so that's what they're feeling. People with Parkinson can have problems with gait as well, so with their walking. And we know that a lot of people will have what we call postural instability, meaning when they stand up, they're not quite stable. And that can lead to falls. And falls are a huge public health problem. So someone with Parkinson is going to be someone usually we think of as older than 60.
This was just going to ask, is there age? So typically it's older than 60.
Typically it's older than 60.
Okay.
But you have people earlier, and and it seems like we're having more and more of these people almost with every disease though. If we were talking about cancer today, we would say there's more cancer.
Hey guys, it's Haylie Pomroy, your host. Right about now, you're probably struggling to achieve the health that you deserve, and you're just not sure what you need to do in order to get it. So what I've done is I've created a special link for you that will give you the nutrition and supplement programs that I use in my private practice to achieve amazing results for my clients and my community. Go to HayliePomroy.com/podcast. Plus, when you use that link, you'll get a 20% discount just because I love you. Again, that's HayliePomroy.com/podcast. Now, back to the episode.
Do we have any idea? I know you said usually greater than 60. Is there more male to female? Is there more men with Parkinson's, female with Parkinson's? Is it pretty down the middle?
It's slightly more men than women. You usually think prototypically of a man with Parkinson, but really you see that really in men and women. And you see it of all ages. You see people, as young as 30s with Parkinson's disease. Probably the most famous person alive right now with Parkinson's disease is Michael J. Fox. So I grew up in the 80s. Michael J. Fox to me was everything. And, I call him America's sweetheart. And he has Parkinson's disease, and he had early onset Parkinson's disease. He wasn't older. He wasn't 60 when he had it. And he was actually part of a cluster. There were people before he moved to the United States. Remember, he's Canadian, much like me. He comes from Canada. And in the sitcom that he was doing in Canada, several of those people actually developed Parkinson's disease. So somebody once asked him, why don't you study that cluster? And the gentleman that he is, he said, there are many clusters in the world, others more important than the one I was part of. And so he's really done an amazing job with the Parkinson's disease, with the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's Disease Research Foundation, really with this ability to raise money, but then also to get different pharmaceutical companies that are normally competitive, get them to actually talk to each other.
So that's great, and his work has been amazing. But are we thinking that there is some sort of an environmental cause, a viral cause? I mean, what are we starting to postulate is the trigger with Parkinson's?
So I'm going to use Michael J. Fox again. He once said that Parkinson's disease is like loading a gun. So what happens is you're going to load the gun with your genetics, and then the trigger is going to be some sort of environmental trigger that's going on. The question is, what exactly is that environmental trigger? We do know more about Parkinson's disease than some of our other ones. We know that things like paraquat, herbicides and pesticides that have been involved in agricultural living, not just in military, but in agricultural living, people have more Parkinson's disease when they're exposed to it. And so we think that the reason is that the dopamine neurons are a little bit fragile. They're strong, but they're a little bit fragile. And so what's going to happen is if you're going to keep on damaging those neurons, eventually you're going to reach the point that you have the symptoms of Parkinson. And in fact, when people have Parkinson's disease, and if we looked inside their brain, already 70 to 80% of the nerves that affect dopamine have been affected.
Really?
Yes, and so that's why we want to look earlier and earlier to try to prevent Parkinson's disease from even happening.
How do we look inside the brain? What type of testing can we do?
The best way to look inside the brain is the way we look when someone passes away, right?
Got it.
So in an autopsy, when you can actually look under the microscope
Yep.
and see what's going on. In the absence of that, we have imaging. Now, people know about MRIs. MRIs aren't used generally for Parkinson's disease. Someone with Parkinson's disease, probably if they had an MRI, it was to look and make sure they don't have something else. Then what we're seeing is that there are more specialized types of MRIs where we look at things such as perfusion, and we're seeing how much the blood flow is going to a certain area, and that might be helpful for us in Parkinson's disease. And we're doing some of that research right here.
Are those like SPECT scans or?
No, those ones are actually, it's PCASL is what it's called. It's actually a perfusion scan using MRI technology.
Okay.
And then we also, what's been FDA approved to be used is something called the DAT scan. And so this is a nuclear scan. And the nuclear scan is more to tell you, is this Parkinson or is this something else? And what you should see is that there's less activity in the area of the brain called the substantia nigra, and that tells the radiologist and tells the doctors this person does indeed have Parkinson's disease. People are starting to use that to actually monitor it as well. Normally, it's just used as a diagnostic tool, but the question is, if we can really change the disease, and so far we have no disease-modifying agents, but if we do develop one, can we actually follow it with something like a DAT scan? And that's one of the things we're trying to do as well.
So when you say there's no disease-modifying agents, that means that currently today, there's not a pharmaceutical or intervention that can reverse this disease.
People have probably seen my videos online, mostly about multiple sclerosis. So I'm very well known in the MS world. When I first went most recently to the Movement Disorder Society American version of the meeting, I walked into the exhibit hall and people looked at me and said, "Oh, why are you here? Because you guys already solved the disease you take care of?" Because we have 20 or more medications for multiple sclerosis.
Right.
We have 0 disease-modifying agents for Parkinson. I think when you go to these scientific meetings, it's palpable. You can feel that people are at the cusp of it. People are ready for it. We're tired of yet another dopamine replacement. Don't get me wrong. It's dopamine, and giving it has been amazing. And if you've seen the movie Awakenings, you know how much it really helped people. But if you just make small changes to either a pill or you make a pump, even a pump that works well, all you're doing is replacing the dopamine. You're just replacing dopamine in a different way. And so if you think about it, you have that way of treating Parkinson. You have deep brain stimulation, which has helped a lot of people. And that's where an electrode is placed into the brain. And by the electrode stimulating, it's actually able to turn off a person's tremor. It's amazing what we're able to do, but we're not changing the underlying nature of the Parkinson's disease. We're not fixing the mitochondria. We're not fixing the cells. And so our goal is to do that.
So if we kind of go back to the concept of the Spanish flu being a trigger at the time, are we seeing or afraid of or have some trepidation about a progression or an increase in Parkinson's post-COVID?
That has certainly been a question. A question has been, COVID, it's a novel coronavirus. What novel problems are we going to see, or what are we going to see that we've already seen? It's going to take a while. It's going to take another 20 years before I think we really know the true depth of, are we seeing more Parkinson? There's people who might report somebody who got diagnosed afterwards, and you don't know, were they diagnosed because they would have had Parkinson anyway? It just happens to be that there was corona, or was it involved? I think we're going to learn more about it, but it's certainly believable, but that there's some sort of viral trigger that's going to lead to it. And in fact, we're actually going to start doing research with the National Institutes of Neurological Diseases and Stroke to look at what we call these human retroviruses that you have already. They're endogenous to you. So they're called ERVs, or human endogenous retroviruses. And it turns out that about 8% of all of our DNA is actually foreign. Not that it's visiting that there's a bacteria in our gut, but actually there's foreign DNA incorporated into the human genome for millions of years. And the question is, does some of that turn on and some of that lead to things like Parkinson's disease? There's been some research looking at that with Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. There was some research looking at multiple sclerosis, or MS. And our question for the government and for the people who are doing the research is, let's go and look at Parkinson. And I would say actually that, to me, is one of Gateway's main missions. It's not just to do the research ourselves. It's to inspire other people who aren't studying Parkinson to take their same resources and move them towards Parkinson. I'm tired of this idea that we don't talk to each other. You have neurologists in the same department doing very similar diseases, and they won't even talk to each other about what they've learned. And it's amazing to me because there's so much overlap that we can learn from each other.
And there's so much siloing in research and so much siloing in medicine. And one of the reasons why we built our community was because I've been in clinical practice for 30 years. And as I would go out, I would go out and I'd venture in and meet incredible, neurologists and immunologists and hematologists and acupuncturists, wherever I was visiting. And I felt like I was gathering these incredible gems of knowledge and information, but it was so siloed, and there wasn't a place where everybody could kind of come together and just ponder on behalf of people that have the desire to get well and to find a cure, and individuals that are investing in research or performing research or are the benefit of the research, right? Being part of a trial. And so that's why we built our community, because I was like, look, through my journey and my adventures, I have gotten to meet brilliant people along the way. And I have a little bit of grief inside that people don't get access to the people that are out there. And I think I watch you guys at Gateway bringing people, in such a non-competitive way, right? Mm-hmm. Together to truly find a cure. And I think that's, I love that. And I know our community did, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you back. Take me back again. And I love the analogy of a loaded gun. So is there a component of a genetic predisposition with people with Parkinson's?
So about 10, 15% of people with Parkinson's disease probably have a genetic form of Parkinson's disease. They have one of the genes that we've already discovered or genes that we will discover, and it looks like that really puts you at risk. It doesn't mean you're absolutely going to have it, but it puts you at a 2-fold or 3-fold or 4-fold or higher-fold risk of developing Parkinson's disease.
But are there things, not from a genetic perspective, but maybe an environmental perspective, like are people that have a traumatic brain injury or car injury, or I read some theory about individuals that have had, major surgeries, lots of anesthesia. I mean, are there things that we know that maybe we could reduce our risk factor by looking at it, maybe pushing us in that direction?
So what you're talking about is modifiable and unmodifiable risk factors, which as a neurologist, we couldn't think of 20 years ago, but now it's amazing because we can. And you're absolutely right. Traumatic brain injury, we see more people who come back from the battlefield, or people who are fighters or boxers, and people oftentimes think of Muhammad Ali, maybe a little bit different, but he had some sort of Parkinson's disease from all the times that he was hit in the head. And so when I see those retired NFL players, that's one of the diagnoses that actually gets them a payout from the NFL, is actually a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Not just the cognitive things, but also Parkinson's disease, because we know that there seems to be more people who develop Parkinson's disease who have been hit on the head multiple times. Now, I'm also the chair of the subcommittee on concussion for Florida high school athletics, which is the other side of the age spectrum, right? Yeah. These are young, healthy sports players who are high school sports in the state of Florida. And one of our biggest problems, obviously, is concussion.
And not allowing for healing time post-concussion. I mean, that's the thing that is, I'm old enough to remember when they would say, have somebody stay up with you all night and get extra sleep once they would keep you awake all night. And now they're like, they're fine. I guess we went through that transition where they thought as long as you can, say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you're okay to go back on the field. But now they're being more cautious.
Now we're being more cautious. We're using this return to play. But the graded return to play, frankly, is useful, I think, for professional athletes where there's a clear incentive for them to play sports. My question always with a child, especially even earlier than high school, is this really what you need to be doing?
Right.
Like it might take your brain actually longer than 7 days, 5 to 7 days. It takes your brain at least 30 days to get better.
We look at, how much cognitive development, how much neurological development is happening. And especially, like you said, pre-puberty, right? When we've got these younger kids that aren't even hormonally developed, right? They don't even have the hormones, the pituitary active in that way. And they're having brain trauma and not given the amount of time to heal. I love that. Is there, and you mentioned military. One of the things that was fascinating to me that oftentimes we think of traumatic or TBI, traumatic brain injury, being concussive by blunt force. Like you said, Muhammad Ali getting punched, but it can be sound waves also too, right? The
Absolutely.
Concussive aspect of...
So when sound waves travel through the air, they can cause a lot of force. And in fact, the blast injuries you see in the military can a lot of times be bigger than the concussions you see as part of sports, where we actually don't even call it TBI or traumatic brain injury, we call it mild TBI. But it's probably not just the actual concussive hits. The Mac Parkman Foundation really focuses on this idea of not just the concussions, but what about the subconcussive hits? I'll give you an example. If you're a high schooler playing baseball, they're going to have a certain amount of times that you're allowed to pitch. It's called the pitch count, and because they don't want to destroy your arm. We don't have that for the brain. We don't say, you know what, you've been hit in the head too many times, that's it, you're done for the season. We only take you out if you can't get better. But otherwise, we just say, oh, you're back to how you were.
Hey guys, it's Haylie, your host. I wanted to bring to your attention the possibility of coming in and doing a study with us. It is called the COVID UP study. And UP stands for Understanding the Post-Viral Phase. You have to be local in South Florida. There are 2 phases of this study. Let me give you the phone number. It's 305-275-5450. And the email is INIMresearch@nova.edu. We are currently looking for patients that are dealing with post-COVID, long COVID. We have 2 phases of that study. Please contact us and see if this could be an opportunity for you to get the care and information that you need.
Hola, soy la doctora Ana Palacio, de la Universidad de Miami. Me encantó participar en el podcast de hoy y quería invitarlos a considerar el estudio COVID UP. Este estudio está tratando de determinar por qué las personas no mejoran después de COVID. Si les interesa saber más de este estudio, por favor llamen al número 305-275-5450 o pueden escribir al email INIMresearch@nova.edu. Les agradezco mucho su interés y los vemos la próxima vez.
So especially right now, because we don't have a cure yet, and we don't even have a great medical intervention per se. I mean, there's some great palliative care, but we've got to protect the brain, and we've got to protect it as early as possible and as often as possible. What other type of lifestyle or modifiable things can people do to have is it brain, or are the dopamine receptor sites elsewhere also? Is there other parts of the body that we need to be gentle? I mean, I'm holistic. I like the whole body to be fed and cared for.
Well, it's actually interesting because Parkinson's disease actually can lend itself to that. If you look in the gut of someone with Parkinson's disease, and everyone's interested in the gut nowadays, you can actually find what we call these alpha-synuclein. So basically these misfolded proteins. Not the same misfolded proteins that you see in Alzheimer's, but actually more and more it looks like people with Parkinson don't just have one type. They also have the Alzheimer type sometimes. It's actually more common to have more than one type of misfolded protein.
But we're seeing it in the gut.
Right, and you're seeing it in the gut, and you're seeing it in the skin. There's a skin test to be able to see it. And so some people have said, well, maybe it travels along the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve is going to be going all the way to the gut. And maybe that's how there's this communication. Why is that's happening? Some people have gone so far to say that it's prion-like. So prion is, if you've heard of mad cow disease,
yes,
or Jakob Creutzfeldt disease.
Early in college, I worked in wasting disease in the deer population at Rocky Mountain National Forest.
Okay,
so it's a prion disease.
That's the deer version of it.
Yes.
And so what happens there is that instead of it being a virus that spread or something infectious, it's actually like a protein that spreads, which is strange to us because we don't think of proteins as being able to right, they're not living in that same sort of way. And so how are they spreading from one to another? There's been some excitement in Parkinson world as well as Alzheimer world as, is this prion-like? Some of us think, that might not be exactly right. I personally think that when you see misfolded protein, I don't think that's the target that you should be treating. I think the misfolded protein is showing you the garbage. It's showing you the damage. It's telling me there's a problem. So that means that it could be used diagnostically, and that's why there, for example, is the skin test. There's work right now on the spinal fluid test. Obviously, spinal fluid or lumbar punctures are very invasive because you have to go and get fluid.
And what are they looking for? Are they looking for autoantibodies?
Well, it's called the seed amplification assay. And there was a lot of news about it in 2024, end of 2023 to 24, where Michael J. Fox Foundation funded a lot of this research. And the FDA actually came out in 2024 and said that we should be using biomarkers like this in drug development. Not very typical for the FDA to do that. And so that's invasive, though. You have to go into the spinal fluid. The question is really, do we have a blood test? I mean, the best would be in the future if we have like a Star Trek kind of thing where you just do that. Yeah. But in the meantime, blood is fine.
And you talked a little bit about potentially things traveling up the vasovagal nerve. Does that bring to mind stress being an impact in a person with either the progression of Parkinson's or the, like you said, loaded gun with somebody pulling the trigger? Can a very stressful episode push a person's body into this?
I'm watching you enough. I know that one of the things you're going to ask me is what are like 3 things people can do to reduce Parkinson's?
Take care of your brain.
And I'm going to tell you,
yes,
they can do diet.
Yes. Wait, we're going to say that again. You guys know food for me is not like medicine. Food is medicine, and food should be the first line of medicine, period. So I want to let you say that D word again. Because diet. Thank you.
Exercise.
Yeah.
And I've got to tell you, exercise, out of all the treatments we have now, it's probably the treatment that has the most disease modification in Parkinson's.
Wow.
So we're trying to figure out exactly what happens during exercise. Like,
okay.
Why is it
maybe
that
the mitochondria being activated. Maybe
right.
Wow.
It could be other release of other chemicals. And some people are looking at those chemicals and seeing if they can make those chemicals in the lab and then give them to people.
Well, they talk a lot about exercising helping with dopamine, right? With individuals that are dealing with seasonal effect, or depression or anxiety. I mean, food and exercise for me are, I don't know. I always tell people it would be to take those away from me. I mean, they're life giving and life.
But then the third thing, sounds easy, but it's not easy, is to reduce stress.
Right.
We know that stress can be bad for the human body in multiple ways. It's not just, I felt stressed. You actually have release of chemicals. You actually have changes in what's going on inside your body. We can actually do blood work and see that there are changes.
Right. So, I mean, I was just reading about the destruction of how the body, which is interesting, you just said about proteins, how the body remodels tissues and proteins and proteins that are released during stress that kill your cells prematurely. I mean, it's like when we're under stress, there's a war that happens in your immune system too. I mean, it's really... I think we underestimate it.
Yes.
And I think we prescribe support for it too, from a physician's perspective.
Absolutely. Right? And then there's the problem that the word stress means multiple things in society. Right. So you think even about like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Some people, and I'm actually one of them, think we should change the name of that diagnosis. We should change it from post-traumatic stress disorder to stress injury. Even just changing that one letter, because a lot of those people are in the military. In the military, the way you get decided of what you're going to get payout from the military or what you're going to do has to do with injuries that happen.
I'm going to just change that word in my own vocabulary because that's what it should be called.
Because a disorder makes it sound like it's a disorder and it's going to involve stress, so is this psychological? As opposed to this is the actual injury that happened because of something else. And it happened because they were exposed to things that were traumatic.
And from a neurologist's perspective, would you say it actually changes the brain?
I think it does change the brain.
Absolutely. Yeah, wow. Okay, I'm changing it, and then we're going to see how we can petition to change it in all of the, that's one of the reasons of getting my PhD and being in a medical school while doing it is because I want to make an impact on the curriculum.
Well, it's interesting. People actually tried to get the American Psychiatric Association to actually change it. They have something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, and the most recent answer was no, they were not going to change it. But they change a lot of things over time.
But that one has to be. I mean, because we now know, we see a difference in the immune system. We see the blood change. We see the chemistry change. We see the brain change. We see the gut change. We see the heart change.
And you're especially talking about a population of people who have given so much to us, but also are less likely to go and seek medical care, especially when it feels like, oh, you can't see that. I was just in a room full of veterans, and besides thanking them all the time, what I was saying to them is the same thing they were saying, that if they break their arm, there's a cast. Other people can see that. If they hurt their brain, nobody else can see that. And so it doesn't feel real to them. They feel like, oh, people are looking at me funny, even though people might not be, but people are looking at me different. People aren't, they think I'm just trying to find an excuse. It's meant even in the world of concussion, I've actually thought at times for children to put a bandage around their head and say, well, that person has a cast on their arm, you have a bandage around your head until you're ready to go back.
I think that hits me hard because I have pretty severe dyslexia, and it's an invisible disability, right? And it's a federal disability. But to get accommodations, it's changing, but it was like, oh, you're just trying to not read, or you're just trying to cheat by listening to audiobooks. And the Institute for the Deaf and the Blind actually first embraced it. And before Audible became Audible, we used to get all of our audiobooks through that from a disability perspective. I want to circle back, and just before we wrap up today, I want to talk, can you just give me a little bit of hint of some of the types of research that you're doing at Gateway right now? It's exciting when I've had the opportunity to talk to yourself, talk to Tom, a couple different people over there. So tell me some of the cool things that are going on.
Well, so at Gateway Institute for Brain Research, we have these people who are working on the computer scientists, right? So they're working on this computer model, and we're trying to figure out the networks that are involved in human disease, specifically in Parkinson's disease. And then our question is, we can take a database of hundreds of thousands of molecules and figure out which of those change and fix those networks. Is
it part AI? I mean, it feels so progressive in a science perspective.
Well, so actually the programming was done before AI. There actually was involvement of AI later, but a lot of it you can do even without necessarily artificial intelligence. You may use machine learning, which is a little bit different. I'm not going to get technical now on computers, but we take a molecule that we think looks interesting there. Then we can go and we can take a person with Parkinson's disease. We can take their blood. We can make their blood turn back into stem cells. They're called iPSCs. So here you have these pluripotent stem cells. And what you can do is you can test those molecules on that person's brain cells in a way. And then you can see, did they get better? So not just theoretically. Now let's treat the actual human being. And that's what we're trying to do.
To giving something that they could potentially have an impact or not, you can do that outside of the body and see if it's even a good idea.
Correct. And that's the most personalized medicine that you can do.
So do you guys have trials going on right now?
We do have trials going on. So we have a trial right here in South Florida, and that trial is opposed to a disease-modifying trial only. It's actually dealing with cognition, so thinking and Parkinson. We thought that was an important topic. Many people talk about movement, and so it's an intranasal delivery. So people are going to twice a day take intranasally both insulin and glutathione. And what happens is at the end of that 6-month, 7-month trial, we'll have a better idea of did it affect cognition and what we call verbal fluency. But we're also measuring all the regular other things that have to do with Parkinson's disease as well.
How does someone get involved in that trial? Do they go to trials.gov? Do they reach out to you specifically? How can they access this?
I think the easiest way to access things is actually just to go to register.gifbr.com. And so when you go there, what you see is we have like a survey that asks you certain questions about yourself. It lets us put you into our database so that we can tell you information about what's going on.
So if there's different trials happening also.
If there's different trials going on. But my goal is much bigger than that, actually. I'm worried about that journey of a person when they go and see a doctor for the first time. What happens to that research journey? So let's say you have Parkinson's disease and you're going to your neurologist and you go with your family to your neurologist and things are fine. And things are fine. You're probably not going to want a research trial. But let's say you have Parkinson's disease and things just don't seem like they're working as well as they could. And you don't know or you can't afford the next thing. And so research is great because you get everything for free. What's that pathway? You go to your neurologist. If they're not the ones doing the research, are they telling you about that research?
Well, what I have found, and that's, again, why we built our community on my website, right? What I had found was a lot of the patients that are treating, a lot of the doctors, that are treating are not involved at all. They're so far removed from translational research, right? At our clinic at INIM, our clinic is a translational research clinic, right? So all of our patients have the opportunity to, we keep them aware in our newsletter. But as I was traveling all over the world and meeting with different doctors, even I would sit down and go on clinicaltrials.gov. I would sit there in the waiting room and I'd be looking up the clinical trials so that we could approach the physician with them. And they would say, well, I don't even know anything about that. There is such a removal from translational research, and physicians, I would say high 99% of the physicians that are practicing aren't looking at potential of clinical trials for their patients. So I feel like the patients have to be these advocates in doing this research and finding out where it is. So that was one of the things on my health journey, coming from, being on anti-rejection drugs and 60 to 80 milligrams of prednisone and being in really poor health to where I'm at in a health victory today, was to shorten the gap for people, right? And so, I sought all of you out for my own health or my client's health as a health strategist. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, there are millions of people don't have access to individuals like you. So talk me through the importance, like you said, when a patient's journey, the second a person has a pre-diagnosis, in my opinion, with something like Parkinson's, it's important for them to be involved, get into newsletters where they can see what the progressive research that's happening.
And that's one of the things we're doing is our goal is to transform Gateway's website, so gifbr.com, transform it to be a hub for understanding research that has to do with Parkinson's disease. So it doesn't matter if you live near one of our trials or you don't. It will give you information about understanding the different phases of trials. When should you be involved? It's different. Someone who hasn't been diagnosed with something yet and they don't know what it is, or someone who's been diagnosed and is early treatment, versus someone who's been diagnosed with something for a while and things aren't going right. Those are different people who are going to need different research trials.
Right. And so I want to just say this as we close. First, I cannot thank you enough for being here. I know everybody's going to want you back, so please say you'll come back.
I'll come back.
Okay, great. It is so nice, you guys, to have a neurologist that first of all, that's so compassionate, so brilliant, but that will answer our questions, because it is so difficult for everybody out there that's listening, you guys. I get it. I understand your pain point of getting access to new ideas and innovative ideas. There is no, I'm going to punctuate what you just said here at the end. There is no one-size-fits-all medicine. We are too biodiverse. We are too complicated. We are too brilliant. We are too amazing for our bodies to have just kind of this magic light switch that we can turn off, especially in neurodegenerative or neuroinflammatory diseases. Diet, exercise, reduction of stress. Please, let's make that the norm every day. To your point, it impacts so many different things in the body, but I love that it can be maybe something modifiable that we can do and protect your brains and your baby's brains, modifiably that we can do to make a positive impact. But then you guys, I will post all of this on my community. I will make sure that all of your website and connections are available on my community. What I decided a long time ago when I had that, moment, right? When you just say, and I always say, I remember exactly what the hospital room smelled like. I remember the dents in my legs from the hospital gown. I remember the smells. I remember the sounds. But at that moment, I promised that I would do everything in my power to shorten the gap between people having a health tragedy to a health victory. And having you here today is going to help so many people that don't have access to people like you. So I just want to thank you I know you're incredibly busy. I know you guys at Gateway are doing brilliant work. And I just want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.